The City of the Fallen. Part 1. The Unholy Arrival. The sun set on the horizon, casting long shadows over the crumbling city of Reagan. It was a place that never seemed to wake, and perhaps that was its greatest curse. The streets were lined with broken glass, abandoned cars, and the kind of silence that pressed on your chest, making it harder to breathe. If you were to walk down these streets, you'd hear only the echo of your own footsteps, yet somehow, it felt like you weren't alone. Reagun had always been a city of secrets, its foundation rooted in things far darker than anyone would dare speak of. It had been built by men who sought to bend the forces of the world to their will, and in doing so, they had summoned something far worse. The city had long ago fallen into decay. Its buildings were shells of what they once were, and its people, well, they hadn't truly been people for years. Victor had been warned about Reagan. The investigators, the paranormal experts, the conspiracy theorists, they all spoke of it in hushed tones, as if the city were some kind of myth, a place too cursed to be real. But Victor, a seasoned exorcist, had never been one to shy away from a challenge. He had dealt with demons, spirits, and the unexplainable for years, but something about Reagan felt different. It was more than just a haunted city. It was a city that had been consumed. He had been hired by a desperate family, the Montagues, who lived on the outskirts of the city. They claimed that something had happened to their daughter Claire after a visit to Reagun. She had returned, changed. Her body was the same, but her eyes, those eyes, had become like two burning pits, filled with something otherworldly. Claire is still inside. Mrs. Montague had begged him over the phone, her voice trembling. We've seen her at night, but it's not her anymore. It's like a demon wearing her skin. Please, you have to help us. Victor had agreed, of course, for a price. But now, standing at the city limits of Reagun, his gut twisted with unease. The air was thick, pregnant with the weight of the unknown. The streetlights flickered erratically, as though the power grid itself was struggling to keep the city alive. But it was more than that. The light itself seemed wrong. He stepped forward, the soles of his boots crunching over broken glass and debris. He had come prepared, his bag heavy with holy water, incense, and the tools of his trade. But nothing could prepare him for the sight that awaited him. As he crossed into the heart of Reagun, the true horror of the place revealed itself. The city's once bustling streets were now empty, save for the occasional shadow that moved too quickly to catch. The buildings around him were decayed, their windows shattered, but the people, if you could call them people, were the most unsettling sight of all. Every figure he saw was motionless, standing on the sidewalk or leaning against the building, their eyes wide and vacant. They didn't move. They didn't speak. But Victor could feel them watching him. All of them. He approached one man standing under a flickering streetlight, his skin pale and grayish, his clothes tattered. The man's head jerked unnaturally toward Victor as he neared, his eyes gleaming with an unholy light. You shouldn't be here, the man rasped, his voice hoarse, as if struggling to speak. You should turn around, before it's too late. Victor stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The words were chilling, but they were not the worst part. It was the look in the man's eyes. There was no soul there, just a hollow, soulless vessel. Something else controlled him. Something evil. The man reached out with trembling hands, his fingers twitching, as though trying to grasp Victor's arm. They're all here, the man whispered, his lips cracking open in a grin that was far too wide for a human mouth. And they want you too. Victor recoiled, stepping back. He could feel the heat radiating from the man's body, a heat that was unnatural, almost as if he were burning from the inside out. A surge of anger and fear struck him, and he quickly reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small vial of holy water. With a swift motion, he threw it at the man. The man screamed, his body jerking violently as the holy water sizzled against his skin. He stumbled back, falling to the ground with a deafening thud. For a moment, he lay motionless, and Victor thought he had finally subdued him. But then the man's body began to twitch again, his limbs moving in grotesque, unnatural angles. His head snapped back, eyes now fully black. "You'll never leave, Victor," the man's voice distorted. "Not until they take what they need." With that, the man's body crumpled to the ground, his eyes still locked on Victor's with that same soulless stare. Victor didn't wait. He turned and ran down the street, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to find Claire. He had to get to the Montag's house before it was too late. As he ran deeper into the city, he saw more people, no, things, standing motionless, staring into the darkness. Some were writhing, their bodies contorting unnaturally, as though something inside them was forcing them to move in grotesque ways. It wasn't until he turned a corner and saw the first real sign of life that he stopped. A young woman stood in the middle of the street. She wasn't standing still like the others. She was moving, walking slowly, with purpose. Her eyes were hollow, but her body was different. It wasn't as if she was possessed. It was as if she was becoming something else, something alien. Something that didn't belong in this world. Victor took a step toward her, but as he did, she stopped and looked directly at him. Her eyes flashed with something more than just vacancy. Something recognizable. A flash of humanity, of Claire, shone through for a moment before the darkness consumed her. She spoke, her voice a soft whisper. "Victor, help me!" But before he could respond, the dark force that had taken over her surged, and her body convulsed violently. She threw her head back, and for the briefest moment, Victor saw what lay beneath the surface. A demon, red-skinned and with horns that twisted into the night, grinned at him from within her. Victor stumbled back, instinctively reaching for his silver blade. He couldn't let it take her completely. He couldn't let it take anyone else. And then, the ground beneath his feet trembled, and the sound of 1,000 voices rose up in unison. They were all here. All of them. The demons. The cursed souls. Reagun was a city lost to them. And now, Victor was its last hope. Part 2. The Demon's Dominion. Victor's heart hammered in his chest, his every instinct screaming at him to run. But his feet were frozen, as if the very air around him had thickened into something viscous, pulling at his limbs. He watched in horror as Claire, no, the demon wearing her skin, twisted and writhed, her mouth opening wide as the foul entity inside her sought to escape. It was only for a moment, but in that brief instant, Victor saw it, the grotesque, crimson-skinned form of the demon as it struggled to take full control. "Victor, help me!" Claire's voice, barely a whisper now, broke through the creature's guttural growl. The humanity in her words made his blood run cold. But before he could move, the demon howled in fury, and Claire's body went rigid, her mouth snapping shut as the transformation completed itself. Her eyes turned black, no voids, as the demon fully claimed her. Her lips curled into a smile too wide to be human. "You should have stayed away," the demon hissed, its voice deep and echoing. "Now you're mine." Victor took a step back, his mind racing. There was no time to waste. The demons were already winning. The city itself seemed to pulse with their presence. He knew that in order to save anyone, he had to confront the source, the heart of the evil that had consumed Reagun. Without another second's hesitation, Victor sprinted past the demon-possessed girl, narrowly dodging her outstretched claws. The streets around him seemed to stretch, elongating unnaturally as if the city itself were conspiring against him. The buildings tilted, their windows broken and empty, their darkened interiors hiding horrors that Victor knew he didn't want to see. "You can't escape!" The demon's voice rang out from behind him, but it was no longer Claire. The demon's voice echoed across the city, filling the streets like a haunting melody. "You're already part of us." Victor's breath quickened, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not while Claire, if it still was her, was out there. The Montags were counting on him. He had to fight. He rounded another corner and came to a standstill, finding himself at the edge of an ancient square. The remnants of statues lined the cobbled streets, their stone faces cracked and worn by time. At the center of the square, a fountain bubbled with blood. The water was thick, clotted with something that looked like tar, swirling in dark, rhythmic patterns. Victor's eyes narrowed. He could feel it in the air, an overwhelming weight, as if the very foundations of the city had been built upon a curse. He wasn't alone. There was a presence here, watching him, waiting for him to make his move. The voices. They were all around him now, whispers that clawed at his mind, sinking into his very soul. The demons were everywhere, but none of them moved. They simply watched. Victor took a step forward, his hand tight around the hilt of his silver blade. His thoughts raced. Where was the source? He could feel the pull of something stronger in the distance, a beacon of malevolent energy, like a dark flame calling him to it. Then, as if summoned by his thoughts, a figure stepped from the shadows of a nearby alleyway. She was tall and slender, with raven black hair that cascaded over her shoulders like a waterfall at night. Her eyes were an unnatural shade of violet, glowing faintly with an eerie light. She wore a long black coat that fluttered in the wind, and her presence alone seemed to warp the air around her, distorting the space like a mirage. Victor tensed, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. He had seen her before, though he couldn't remember where. The woman smiled, her lips curling into a thin, mocking line. "So you've come to confront us," she said, her voice calm, almost melodic. "I must admit, I wasn't expecting someone like you." Victor's grip tightened on his blade. "Who are you?" he demanded. The woman stepped closer, her heels clicking against the cobblestones with every movement. "Names are a luxury in Reagan. Here we are all one. We were born of the same darkness. But if you insist..." She bowed her head slightly, her violet eyes gleaming with amusement. "I am Celine." "Celine," Victor echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. A name he had heard only in the most forbidden texts, a name tied to the demon kings that had been sealed away long ago. Celine laughed, a soft, sinister sound that slithered into Victor's ears. "Yes. The one you seek. The one who gave Reagun its name. The one who freed the city from its chains." She tilted her head to the side, studying him with a predator's gaze. "But of course, you didn't think you could just walk into a city possessed, did you? You, of all people, should understand the price of such folly." Victor's pulse quickened as the weight of her words settled with him. The city Reagun, it wasn't just a place. It was a portal, a doorway to something far darker. Something Celine had unleashed. "You did this," Victor hissed, taking a step toward her, fury building in his chest. "You allowed this evil to consume the people. You opened the gate." Celine's smile deepened, her eyes gleaming with a predatory delight. "Not just the people, Victor. Everything." Before he could react, she raised her hand, and the air around him grew cold. The ground trembled as if the city itself were awakening. Victor stumbled, the force of the darkness pushing against him like an invisible wave. The demon-possessed citizens that had once been motionless now began to stir. Their hollow eyes snapped open, all of them turning in unison to face him. The demon-possessed souls began to move, their bodies twisting in unnatural ways as they advanced toward him, their mouths opening wide in silent, insatiable hunger. Victor's hand shot to his side, pulling free a vial of holy water and throwing it at the nearest demon. It screamed in agony, but there was no time to savor the victory. Celine's power surged, and the ground beneath Victor cracked open, splitting the cobblestones into jagged shards. Victor knew he had to end this, now. He looked toward the horizon, where the true source of the curse pulsed like a beacon. Reagun's heart beat beneath him, its demonic thrum pulling him toward it. He had to reach the city's core. As Celine advanced toward him, the demons closing in, Victor made his decision. He turned and ran, his legs burning as he sprinted toward the center of the square, toward the blood fountain, toward the dark heart of Reagun. Behind him, Celine's voice rang out, mocking him with a laugh that echoed through the city. "You can't outrun fate, Victor." Part 3. The Heart of Darkness. Victor's feet slammed against the cracked stone of the city's central square, each step heavy with the weight of what he was about to face. His breath came in short gasps as he forced himself forward, his gaze fixed on the fountain in the center of the square. The blood, thick and clotted like tar, bubbled and churned, a sickening sound that echoed off the empty buildings. Reagun's heart. The ground trembled beneath him, and he could feel it now, a force, palpable and thick, pulling at him like 1,000 invisible hands. The darkness of the city wrapped around him, its tendrils creeping into his very thoughts, filling his mind with whispers that made his skin crawl. "You're too late, Victor." Celine's voice floated toward him from behind. "You should have stayed away." Victor's heart hammered in his chest, but he refused to stop. He had to reach the fountain, the epicenter of the curse. The demon city had been built atop something ancient, something older than any demon, older than any human. It was the reason Reagan had fallen into this hell, the reason it was consumed by darkness. He glanced back, just for a moment. The possessed citizens were closing in, their movements jerky and unnatural, their eyes black as voids. The demons within them were awake now, fully conscious, and they were hungry. They followed him like a tide, a wave of mindless, soulless creatures. Each step they took only brought them closer to their goal, Victor. But he had a plan. Victor reached into his coat and pulled out a small, cracked mirror, a tool his father had given him in his youth, one he had never truly understood until then. The mirror was old, its edges worn from years of use. It had been used to reflect the true nature of things, to see beyond the veil. He held it up, and for a split second, the reflection in the glass was not his own. Instead, he saw Reagan, but not the crumbling, haunted city he had entered. No. This was something else. Something darker. In the mirror, the city appeared as it had once been, glorious, proud, alive. But now, the skyline was twisted. It was as if a great, invisible hand had stretched the city, warping it into something grotesque. Towers rose like twisted spires, reaching toward the heavens. The streets were filled with shadowed figures, their faces blank, their bodies moving in eerie synchrony. And at the center of the mirror's reflection was the fountain, the source of it all. The place where the curse had begun. The mirror shuddered in his hand, and Victor saw something else. A figure, standing in the heart of the fountain, its back to him. Long hair, flowing like a river of night, skin pale as the moon. Its head tilted just slightly, as if sensing his gaze. Victor's heart skipped a beat. It was Celine. No, he thought, his grip tightening on the mirror. It's not her. It's the source. The thing controlling her. He looked away from the mirror, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to hesitate. The city was alive with dark energy. Every step he took toward the fountain felt like it was dragging him deeper into the abyss. But there was no choice. He had to face the source of the curse, or die trying. Victor reached the fountain. The stone structure towered above him, a grotesque monument to the twisted forces that had shaped Reagun. At its base, the blood bubbled and churned, pulsing in rhythm with the city's heartbeat. The fountain was not just a place of water. It was a gateway. Without a second thought, Victor stepped forward and plunged his hand into the blood. At once, his body was seized by an overwhelming surge of power. It wasn't the blood itself, it was the force that used it. The blood was alive, writhing in his palm like an organism. It burned, seared through him, filling his veins with something ancient, something evil. Victor fell to his knees, gasping for air as the darkness closed in around him. The voices grew louder, a cacophony of whispers that filled his mind with despair. "You are one of us now." The voice was deep, resonant, a chorus of demons speaking in unison. "Reagun belongs to us. You belong to us." Victor's vision blurred. He could feel his body trying to resist, but the force was too great. The darkness threatened to consume him. The demon that had once inhabited the city was alive in him now. He could feel its influence, its power, and for the briefest moment, he wanted to give in. But then, the image of Claire flashed in his mind, the girl who had been swallowed whole by the city's curse. She had been innocent, once. He couldn't let her, all of them, remain trapped. With everything he had left, Victor forced himself to stand. He dug deep into his soul, reaching for the strength he didn't know he had. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his silver blade, his only ally. He raised it above his head, and with a primal scream, he drove the blade into the center of the fountain. For a moment, the world stood still. Then, the ground shattered. The blood in the fountain erupted, splashing into the air like a storm of crimson rain. The entire square seemed to tremble as the energy that had kept Reagan bound was ripped apart, torn to pieces by the sheer force of the silver blade. The city's pulse stuttered. The air thickened, swirling like a violent storm. Victor's hand shook, his grip faltering. The blade began to glow, brighter than he had ever seen, its silver edge burning with a light that seemed to cut through the very fabric of reality. It wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was the key to ending this madness. With one final effort, Victor drove the blade deeper into the fountain. The blood in the air screamed, a terrible, guttural wail that filled the streets and echoed off the decaying buildings. And then, everything stopped. The silence was deafening. Victor dropped to his knees, panting, his head spinning. The fountain had fallen silent, the blood no longer bubbling. The ground beneath him ceased to tremble, and the oppressive weight of the curse seemed to lift. But he could feel the toll it had taken on him. The power that had surged through him, he was tainted now. The darkness, though broken, had left its mark. But there was something else. The people. The possessed. Victor looked around him. They were still here. But they weren't moving anymore. The demons were silent. And in that silence, he could feel it. Something had changed. The hold over the city had been broken, but the demons were still there, watching. And then, from behind him, he heard a familiar voice. "Victor!" Victor turned slowly, his heart racing in his chest. There, standing at the edge of the square, was Claire. Her face was pale, her eyes no longer black voids, but the bright green of her human self. She looked at him, a flicker of recognition in her gaze. She whispered, stepping closer, her voice trembling. "I remember." Victor's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. He had saved her, but the cost was too high. There was no going back. Not for her, not for him. Reagan was free, but it was still a city of the fallen. and Victor knew, deep in his bones, that the battle was far from over. Part 4 Among the Hollow. The rain had started sometime after the blood had stopped. It fell in sheets now, thin, gray needles cutting through the thick silence of Reagun like a burial shroud draped across a corpse. The city that had once groaned with the weight of ancient demons now held its breath, as if uncertain whether it should sigh in relief or scream. Victor stood beside the cracked fountain, his legs trembling, his blade buried deep in the stone like a monument to defiance. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his skin, and the blood, so much blood, stained his hands, his chest, even his face. Across the square, Claire hadn't moved. She stood at the edge of the shadows, half in the light of the broken street lamp, half obscured by the encroaching fog. Her eyes, human once more, were fixed on him with something between awe and terror. "I remember," she said again, softer this time. "The city. The voices. All of them." Victor stepped toward her, his knees nearly giving out. "You're free. You fought it. You're—" "No," she interrupted, shaking her head. "I didn't fight. I watched. I felt it. I was locked behind my own eyes while something else wore my skin. And it liked it." She raised her hands, staring down at them as if they didn't belong to her. "It still likes it. I can feel it watching me. It's still here, Victor. They're all still here." Victor turned to the street beyond the square. The people of Reagan stood in doorways, pressed against broken windows, crouched on balconies slick with rain. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Silent. Unmoving. Their eyes had returned to human color, yet behind those eyes, nothing. Not pain. Not joy. Not fear. Just the hollow echo of what once was. Victor gritted his teeth. The blade had severed something, cut through the black thread binding this city together. But it hadn't banished the demons. It had shaken them loose, left them adrift, without form, without anchor. Now they lingered. Hungry. Searching. "Claire," Victor said carefully, "you need to leave the city. Now. There might still be time." Claire didn't move. "I don't think I can." "Try." She closed her eyes and took a step. Then another. She made it 5 paces before she stopped, her face contorted in silent agony. She dropped to her knees, clutching her skull, her mouth wide open but producing no sound. Victor rushed forward, kneeling beside her. "What is it? What's wrong?" She looked up at him, and there it was, something else, peering out from behind her gaze. Not fully formed. Not fully gone. "They don't want me to leave," she whispered. "They need people here. They feed on the city itself. On the boundaries. On the isolation. If I cross the edge, they'll take me back, and finish what they started." Victor felt it too, the pull. The way the air seemed thicker the closer one moved toward the city limits. The city wasn't a trap. It was a container. A prison for something that could not be allowed to spread. He helped Claire back to her feet. "We're going to find the root of this. The real source." Claire wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, her eyes wide with fear. "You already destroyed the fountain. You saw what was underneath, Celine. The blood. What else could there be?" Victor turned slowly, looking out across Reagan's broken skyline. "There's always a throne," he said. They made their way north, past the old cathedral, its spire split in two like a snapped bone, and toward the black heart of the city. The rain followed them, steady and cold. The deeper they went, the more the buildings twisted in impossible angles, brick and bone fusing in architecture that should not have stood. Some of the streets no longer obeyed gravity. Lampposts grew sideways out of walls. and rooftops bent downward, dripping shadow like tar. The city had changed. It was rebuilding itself. Claire said little as they moved. She was deteriorating. Her hands twitched when she didn't think Victor was watching. Her eyes flicked toward alleyways as though something, was calling to her. Victor could see the toll. Every moment she stayed in Reagan, she was unraveling. And he was too. He could feel a heat crawling under his skin at night now. A low, growling hum that rose from the soles of his feet to the base of his skull. Whispers had begun to follow him, curling in his ear like smoke. "We know you, Victor. You belong here. You opened the gate." He shook them off. Kept walking. Always north. Until they found it. The building was old, but not crumbling like the rest. It stood untouched, as though the decay had simply avoided it. A massive courthouse, 4 stories high, its stone face scorched with symbols, sigils Victor didn't recognize. Not holy. Not protective. Binding. Claire hesitated. "This is where it began." Victor nodded. "The first possession?" Claire's jaw clenched. "No. The first ritual." She stepped forward and placed her hand against the massive double doors. They opened with a sigh, like breath leaving a dying man's lungs. Inside, torches burned with black fire, casting warped shadows across the walls. The air stank of sulfur and old meat. And from the far end of the chamber, seated atop a throne carved of bone and steel, Celine waited. She hadn't moved. Not since the blood had stopped. Victor stepped inside, hand on the hilt of his blade. "I killed your source," he said. "The fountain. The gate. It's over." Celine lifted her head slowly. Her violet eyes glowed brighter than ever, and behind them, something ancient stirred. "You didn't close it," she said. "You opened it wider." Victor felt the weight of her words slam into him like a brick to the chest. "You severed the knot. Now everything flows freely. The city is no longer sealed." She stood. The throne shuddered beneath her. "You've broken the curse, and unleashed the city," Claire screamed. Victor turned just in time to see her collapse. Her eyes rolled back in her head. Black veins spread across her skin like ink in water. Her mouth opened in a voiceless howl as something inside her fought to break loose. Celine smiled. "She was always meant to be the vessel. I chose her long ago. You only brought her back so I could finish what I started." Claire's body convulsed on the floor, her limbs jerking violently. Her scream rose into a deafening shriek that split the air like thunder. Victor ran to her, dropping to his knees. "Claire, no! Fight it!" But she couldn't hear him anymore. The last of her humanity slipped from her gaze. Celine raised her arms, and Reagun awoke. The city began to scream. Part 5. When the city breathes. Victor's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest tight, his heart pounding. He had failed. He could feel it, deep in his bones. The city was alive now, and there was no escaping it. Claire writhed beneath him, her body shaking violently as the demon inside her fought to break free. Her eyes had gone dark again, but this time, there was something more, something deeper. The bloodline had taken root. Her humanity had slipped from her like sand in an hourglass, lost to the grip of something older, far more powerful. The walls of the courthouse began to rumble, and the black torches flared higher, casting grotesque, shifting shadows across the chamber. The air felt thick, like a storm was brewing, but it wasn't one of nature. It was the storm of something far darker. The city itself breathed around them, exhaling the weight of its ancient curse. Victor's grip on his blade tightened as Celine stepped forward, her presence commanding, suffocating. She walked through the air as though it weren't even there, her movements graceful, fluid. She looked down at Claire's convulsing form, her eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "You still don't understand, do you, Victor?" Celine's voice was cold, a whisper that vibrated in the air like a tuning fork. "This city is a living thing. I've made it that way. When I opened the gates, I did not release a single demon, but an entire world. And now that world has been awakened. It calls to you. It calls to all of us." Victor's breath caught in his throat. He glanced around the chamber, his mind reeling. The walls were shifting, melting almost, becoming something other than stone, something more like flesh. The floor beneath his feet felt warm, like the ground itself had been infused with life. It was all part of the city's heart, and the heart was now beating. Celine raised her arms, her dark eyes glowing like twin stars. The demons that had been lurking in the shadows of Reagun suddenly emerged. They slithered from the walls, from the cracks in the floor, from every crevice in the darkened corners. They were no longer the faceless husks that had wandered aimlessly through the city. No, now they were alive, hungry, their red eyes gleaming with malice. Their mouths opened wide, filled with jagged teeth, as they surrounded Victor, their forms shifting and twisting in the light. "They were never just vessels, Victor," Celine said, her voice louder now. "The humans who walked this city were always just pieces for something far greater. Reagun was not built by men. It was built by the devourers. The hungry, the fallen, the forgotten." Victor's mind raced, struggling to keep up with the weight of her words. He had thought he was fighting to save the people of Reagun. But what if the true horror of this place was that it was never meant to be saved? What if it was already too far gone? He didn't have time to dwell on that thought. The demons were closing in, and the air had thickened with an oppressive, suffocating presence. Victor could feel them pressing against him. Too many, too fast. "You have nothing left," Celine purred. "No hope. No light. The city is hungry, and it will consume everything. Starting with you." Victor's grip on his silver blade tightened as he swung it through the air, the sharp edge cutting through the nearest demon with a blinding flash of silver light. The creature screamed, a shrill, piercing sound that made his ears ring, and it dissolved into a cloud of black smoke. But there were too many. More were surging forward, their claws extended, their fangs bared. For every demon he struck down, two more appeared in its place. The weight of the curse pressing on his mind, his body growing weaker with each passing moment. Claire's screams filled the air, her body writhing violently, her voice a guttural, otherworldly sound now. They were coming for him. Victor's mind snapped back to her. "Claire," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You have to fight it. You're still in there. I know you are. Please." But Claire's eyes were black now. The humanity was gone. There was nothing left but the thing inside her, the thing that had been awakened. It grinned at him. No, it laughed, her mouth stretching impossibly wide, her voice layered with the shrieking voices of demons. "You cannot save her." Celine's voice rang out, soft but unyielding. "She is ours now. Just like the others. The city owns them. It owns you." Victor's breath hitched, a cold wave of terror crashing over him. There was no saving Claire. Not like this. She was gone. Reagun had taken her, had taken everything. The city had devoured her soul, and now it hungered for her. But Victor wasn't finished. He had felt it, the pull, the call of the city. The way it had wrapped itself around his mind. He could feel it now, as if the very ground was pressing against his thoughts, as if it were trying to reach into his soul. He had been touched by the curse. He had fought to break it, but he was part of it now, too. And yet there was something else, something hidden, buried beneath the weight of the curse. It was a flicker of hope, a small flame that burned in the heart of Reagan's darkness. The fountain had been the key, but the city itself, Reagun, was the prison. Victor closed his eyes. The demons were closing in around him, their claws scratching at his flesh. He could feel their breath on his skin. But there, in the center of it all, he felt the heartbeat of the city. The true heart. And in that heartbeat he heard the pulse of its prisoner. The key. With everything he had left, Victor pushed himself forward, plunging into the center of the city's heart. He had to get there. He had to end it. No matter the cost. The ground cracked beneath his feet, and a flash of light blinded him. For a moment, he was lost in the agony of it, the pain of the curse pulling at his very essence. But then he heard it. The scream. The roar. Reagun was waking. Reagun was dying. Victor slammed his blade into the ground, and in that moment, the city screamed. Not in anger. Not in hunger. But in release. The end.